Hello, welcome to the first panel of today's conference day, and we will make a start with Claire Burridge.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Is the volume all right? Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Barbara, for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers for putting on this fantastic conference. And thank you all for being here, whether you're joining in person or online. So I'm thrilled to be kicking off this morning's session, which we actually put together collectively. And so we've called this the transmission of medical knowledge beyond Byzantium in the 9th and 10th centuries. So I hope you'll also excuse us as a bit of interlopers here, but hopefully there will be some rich discussion thinking outside or thinking about the bigger picture. So more specifically, I'll be concentrating on Latin material found in manuscripts that were produced in Western Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries. Although our papers do move in slightly different directions, again, hopefully there will be lots of points of intersection that we can return to in the discussion. Okay, so with that brief introduction, I'm going to jump right into the manuscripts, starting with the image on the screen. And apologies that we've put everyone in the dark, but this is because I think all of our presentations have quite a few manuscript images, so hopefully this means the visuals will work. So here we're looking at a page from a martyrology, a list of saints and their feast days arranged calendrically. Given where we are in the year, the 10th of May, I've selected the folio with the final entries for April and for much of May. Many names are recorded alongside some other relevant calendrical details, such as information about the movements of the sun and moon, which the arrows pointing to an example, as well as some calendrically orientated medical information, such as notes about Egyptian days, or days that were thought to be unlucky, especially with respect to matters of health. While astrological and prognostic information is frequently included in martyrologies, such calendars are not typically associated with dietary advice. And so you might be wondering why I've used this to launch into a paper about this very topic. But that's because in this case, there is actually some medical dietary information that's been added to this page. It's tricky to spot, and I won't test everyone right now, but a slightly later scribe writing in a lighter brown ink added the names of two plants at the very start of May, which you can see here. So it's wormwood and fennel. And though this might at first just look like a somewhat random addition, this fits with the advice recorded in certain traditions of monthly health regimens, a type of text that circulated widely in the early medieval West. Monthly regimena are guides to preventative healthcare that concern dietetics in the broadest sense and incorporate not only information about the foods and drinks that one should consume or avoid in each month, but also recommendations regarding exercise, bathing, bloodletting, and so on. Frank-Dieter Gromke studied the Latin tradition of such treatises, publishing a collection of editions and translations in the 1980s, in which he divided the known early medieval regimena into a number of different types and subtypes. Across several of these textual families, the advice given for the month of May notes very specifically that these two plants should be used. So for a quick comparison, the image now on the screen presents a much more typical example of such a text. This monthly regimen is located within the middle of a 9th century medical compendium, today housed in St. Gall. This particular regimen falls into Gromke's type 2, type 2A specifically, and is followed by another diet-centered treatise just below. Oh, and sorry, that's in the brackets, that's the main text. And so these connected texts demonstrate the centrality of dietetics and preventative medicine within the early medieval Latin healthscape. But returning to the martyrology, here it looks like we have a very tiny excerpt from a monthly regimen that was added to a calendar whose primary, or at least original purpose was of a more liturgical or spiritual nature. How did this information end up here? What does this tell us about the early medieval individuals who were using the manuscript and their access to medical knowledge? What can we learn about the dissemination of dietetic thinking in the early Middle Ages based on the appearance of such an excerpt? And more specifically, thinking about this case, were similar comments added to this martyrology's other months? And does dietetic advice appear in other unexpected contexts? The short answers, very short answers to these last two questions are yes and yes. And so for the rest of my paper, I'll be exploring this phenomenon, the addition of health advice concerning food and drink in early medieval Latin manuscripts, focusing specifically on regimina. Before we look at more examples in the manuscripts, I'll just provide a little background to this investigation. I've recently joined the University of Oslo's mini-text project, so I'm now studying the addition of medical texts to unexpected contexts. That is, their addition to non-medical manuscripts. This means that I'm working on writings that we would normally expect to encounter in a medical compendium, like the regimen in the St. Gall Codex, but that instead appear as additions in flyleaves, margins, or other blank spaces, such as the available space created in and around the martyrology. And here I should note that the mini-text project does not only focus on medicine. Its scope is much, much broader. The project is aiming to explore all surviving early medieval so-called mini-texts, which for the purposes of the project are defined as Latin texts added to manuscripts before the year 1000 that do not, at least to a 21st century reader, appear to relate directly to the manuscript's primary textual contents. And I'd be happy to talk more about the project and medical mini-texts more broadly in the questions. In terms of what I've been finding, there are definitely gray zones, like the addition of plant names to the martyrology. Their addition here is related to the main text, since it's aligned to its monthly framework, but I would argue that this relationship is due to the main text's structure rather than its content, since the information presented by the martyrology and by the mini-text stem from entirely different bodies of knowledge. On this basis, the added plant names align with the unexpected nature of mini-texts, and that makes it important to consider this example alongside other cases in the mini-text corpus. Although the phenomenon of mini-texts has not been widely studied, it turns out that a vast amount of medical knowledge, including dietary advice, was recorded in unexpected manuscript contexts. So since joining the mini-text project in January, I've been able to transcribe and edit about half of the roughly 200 medical mini-texts in the project's database, a database that includes nearly 4,000 mini-texts and counting. So there may be more medicine on the horizon. From this sample, I've been really fascinated to see the range of medical material addressed in mini-texts, from pharmacy to medical prognostics, and from dietetics to treatises on urine analysis. It seems that essentially every genre or general topic that you can find in early medieval medical manuscripts, you can also find added to the flyleaves, margins, and other blank spaces of contemporary non-medical manuscripts. However, when taking a closer look at the individual texts, the picture is often more limited. With respect to dietetics, so far I've seen medical information about diet recorded in two primary ways, either as recommendations accompanying medical recipes or in relation to monthly regimina. Other dietetic treatises, like the famous letter of Anthimus, which Jan will be speaking a bit more about, don't tend to appear as mini-texts, at least what I've seen so far. It's also important to remember that these findings are still preliminary, and once I've been able to work through all of the medical mini-texts in the database, I'd like to pursue a more detailed study of the patterns that have emerged in terms of the types of textual traditions that appear as mini-texts, considering what's represented as well as what's missing. But in today's paper, I'll be focusing on what I have found at this stage. So that's why we'll be focusing on the Regimina. So about a decade ago, Klaus-Dietrich Fischer published a great article in which he identified several additional copies of Regimina that were unknown to Gronke. And he also noted that these texts often appear in spaces and contexts of a somewhat marginal nature, and that it's likely that we'll continue to find further examples of such texts if we look outside of the codicological environments in which we typically expect to find health advice. So just as Fischer predicted, by focusing on unexpected manuscript contexts, the Minitext project has now documented a number of previously unknown texts that belong to this tradition of monthly Regimina. The other examples that I've been analyzing, unlike the very brief extracts in the Martyrology, contain larger amounts of text per month, though in some cases they include only a selection of months, rather than the full 12-month cycle. So I have a few highlights to share. In this first case, we're looking at the top half of the final page of a 9th century manuscript that mostly contains works by Augustine. This side of the folio was originally left blank, but then in the 10th century, a scribe added a monthly regimen covering June through February. Apologies for, that one's particularly hard to read, but in this late 9th century codex housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, that contains a diverse array of non-medical texts, such as a life of Alexander. Multiple mini-texts were added to this flyleaf in the 10th century. The top half of the edition is an excerpt from the Liber Ordine of Pseudo Isidore, and then there's a brief selection of monthly health advice that only contains recommendations for March and April. One might wonder why such a brief section of a regimen was added, since it wouldn't have been much use for most of the year. One possibility, since regimina often begin in March, aligning with earlier calendar precedents, is that it was, in fact, just the start of the text, and that the scribe intended to add more, but for whatever reason, didn't. This is a recurring pattern within many texts, but something to save for another paper. And then finally, in this mid-9th century miscellany that's also held in the Bibliothèque Nationale, various medical texts, ranging from recipes to a monthly regimen, were added over several blank pages near the beginning of the codex, about a generation after it was produced. The monthly regimen falls in the middle of the page, and we're zoomed in. And this one does cover all 12 months, though the individual entries are quite abbreviated. So this brief highlight reel of regimina as mini-texts raises many, many more questions and different research directions than can be explored in a 20-minute conference paper. Why were they recorded? And why in these particular places? By whom? And what were those individual sources? The list certainly goes on and on. And since I can only scratch the surface of these topics today, I'll focus on the relationship between regimina and regimina excerpts recorded as mini-texts and their non-mini-textual counterparts, before wrapping up by situating this selection of mini-texts within the bigger picture. So we'll start small and return to the Martyrology, where plant names were added to most months, in fact. So here we're looking at the Martyrology's opening folio, and you can see that ginger and rhubarb were added right at the start of January. Meanwhile, at the beginning of June, here, sage and savin appear. I've mentioned that these plants parallel the herbs named in a number of the regimina families, but to what extent is this actually the case? So the next few slides have some tables that are a bit text heavy. It's just to illustrate the ways in which the mini texts correspond to the wider regimina traditions. And I've tried to, there will be some color coding as well to help highlight these. Okay, so here I've only selected the months that we've looked at in the manuscript. So that's January, May, and June, because you can only fit so much information on a slide. And likewise, I've only shared Gronke's first 3 regimen types, but there are, of course, many more comparisons that could be made. Within this selection of types, you can still see two of the longer form regimens, that's types 1 and 2A, as well as one of the more abbreviated forms, type 2B. And so that one only lists specific plants linked to each month. The text added to the martyrology is in the slightly darker column, which might not be apparent to everyone in the room. Now with the blue highlighting, this shows how the information that's found in each of these regimina types also corresponds to what we see in the martyrology. So to review, for January, ginger and rhubarb were added to the martyrology, and that parallels all three regimen types here. For May, it's wormwood and fennel, which we also see in all three regimen types, though type 1 also includes germander. And for June, sage and savin were added, just like in the regimina, though types 2A and B specify that it's the flowers of these plants. The rest of the plants in the martyrology also parallel these families of texts. So now we're going to return to the nearly complete regimen added to the final page of the manuscript containing works by Augustine. How does this mini text compare to the traditions? So in our next table, I've taken out the type 1 regimen and replaced it with our mini text. And of course, May is missing because the mini text only began in June and went through February. Again, the blue highlighter shows that the plant names are maintained. And then given that this mini textual regimen includes considerably more text, we can see that although it's a bit shorter than the type 2A regimen, essentially all of the text that appears in the mini text has parallels with this tradition. So to review this one, in January, the brown highlighter shows that 3 cups of wine should be drunk daily on an empty stomach, and then in the pink, that blood shouldn't be let. And for June, a cup of water should be drunk, that's red, beer and mead should be avoided, that's the yellow, and lettuce should be consumed, green. I tried to make sense of the colors a bit. Since the rest of the mini text paints a very similar picture to the level of overlap seen in these 2 months, it looks like we have a slightly abbreviated regimen that most closely parallels Gronka's type 2A. And then finally, we'll return to the full 12-month, but more heavily abbreviated regimen that appears in this Paris manuscript. And in this table, in addition to showcasing the mini text entries for our selected months, I brought back type 1, removed type A, and then added type 7. A little confusing, but that's because type 7 is a regimen that has some notable differences when compared to the first types we've seen, and it's only known from one manuscript, Leonie 426. But it does have some striking parallels to the mini text. So like the other mini texts that I've shared, the information presented in this abbreviated regimen fits into the wider tradition, though it doesn't provide the full picture. In January, you can see that we only have rhubarb, not ginger and rhubarb, but the information that has been recorded does appear in other regimina. And what I find especially striking with this mini text is that although it is abbreviated, it includes information that's found in different branches across the wider regimen family. Of the 3 months I've highlighted, this is most notable in June, where we see the 2 plants that feature most regularly in many of the regimen types, sage and savin, but these are not mentioned in the Leonie manuscript, which instead lists butcher's broom, a plant that, as far as I know, has only been identified in this regimen. And yet, in the Paris mini text, we see butcher's broom alongside sage and savin. Examples like this one that brings together content documented in these different branches of the regimen family remind us that these related regimen traditions circulated very widely and that the surviving manuscripts only preserve individual snapshots. The incorporation of evidence from mini textual regimens, even when incomplete or highly abbreviated, can, I think, help us to expand and update the types identified by Gronka, or even to consider whether an approach that takes into account the individual codicological contexts in which we find regimina may be a more fruitful direction for future research. So the inclusion of mini-texts in this conversation, moreover, also invites us to think more about the readers and scribes who were engaging with this material. That regimens keep turning up in these unexpected contexts suggests that there was a sustained interest in such texts and that this information was very widely diffused. And this takes me to my final points, some initial thoughts regarding the transmission of dietetic knowledge, as well as how the regimens compare to what I've been finding with other medical mini-texts. First, although seasonally and then monthly structured regimina traditions have very deep roots, as others have noted, these Latin regimens present significant differences from Byzantine texts. In addition to differences in structure and format, there are notable differences in their content. The frequent appearance of advice concerning beverages like beer, for example, strengthens the idea that these Latin traditions were influenced by the Northern Western European context in which they were recorded. Contemporary documentary evidence from the Carolingian world, such as capitularies, as well as dietary treatises with Frankish connections, such as Anthimus' letter, indicate the importance of beer in the Latin West during this period. Yet at the same time, I think we should be careful not to overemphasize a sense of distinct Frankish medical traditions. While the appearance of beer may demonstrate how these texts were adapted and updated to suit local conditions, they remain plugged into wider healing traditions. The particular plants that are paired with specific months, for example, are routinely seen in pharmaceutical writings from the Latin West, but also much further afield and in earlier traditions. While many of the plants that I've shared, such as sage, savin, fennel, and wormwood, are humble herbal products that could easily fit with the idea that these regimina may be rooted in local contexts, it's important to remember that ginger and rhubarb are recommended in January. And although I didn't show images or tables of these months, we also see cloves and pepper recommended in October, followed by cinnamon in November, ingredients that were true exotics and that frequently appear in the contemporary recipe literature, thereby confirming that these regimens are not simply homegrown approaches. So with this in mind, I think these regimina, whether recorded as mini-texts or within medical compendia, are reflective of the general picture of medicine in the Latin West in this period. We see a body of knowledge that has deep connections to earlier traditions, that demonstrates the continuing influences of Latin and Greek sources, and yet that also shows signs of adaptation and evolution over time. Ultimately, the findings I've presented today are just the beginning. Again, this is work that's still in the early stages, and as I work through more mini-texts, the patterns may shift. Moreover, although I've only shared the tip of the iceberg, or the mini-text iceberg, I hope I've demonstrated not only the potential that mini-texts have for contributing to our understanding of early medieval medicine, but also the need for more research in this direction. So thank you again, and just some acknowledgements.
And let's move on to Leonie All for the next presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. My colleagues have graciously agreed to let me say a few words because I am a grad student, and you might have seen what's been happening at universities all across Europe and also in different other countries, and including my home institution, which is Freie Universität Berlin. And we are attending this amazing, wonderful conference as hundreds of students across universities worldwide are being arrested, beaten, and hindered in exercising their right to free speech. If you're a member of a university or an academic institution, I would like to take this moment to urge you to stand with your students and with your colleagues, to stand up for academic freedom and the right to free expression. And I'd like to remind all of us that research is never apolitical, and we can also not afford to be apolitical. Thank you so much. With this opening statement, I'd like to make a very smooth transition to my paper. Thank you, Claire, so much for your lovely paper. I'm very excited to have more conversations about any overlaps that we have. So I'll be talking today about an Arabic dispensatory from 10th century Al-Andalus. And I came across the manuscript of this text in 2021, back in the first pandemic winter in the dark times. And I then took this text to be anonymous, but it has since turned out to be a Kitab Sina'at al-Yad fi al-Ashriba wa ghayr dhalika, which is also known as the Aqrabadin, or the Dispensatory, by Andalusian physician Ibn Abd Rabbi. It is an unusual text in two respects. So Dispensatory is one of very few Arabic works on compound remedies composed in the Western Mediterranean. And in this part of the Arabic-speaking world at this time, books on simple remedies seem to have been much more popular than books on compound remedies. In addition, and uncommonly for the genre of Arabic dispensatories, the text contains recipes not only for medicinal applications, such as pills, electuaries, and syrups, but also for various perfumes and aromatic substances. Incorporating older material from contexts both nearby and further removed in time and space, the dispensatory serves as an important testimony to how pharmaceutical and medical knowledge traveled across the Mediterranean and back again. This is also evidenced by the appearance of material from Ibn Abd Rabbi's text in later pharmacopoeias, mostly from the Eastern Mediterranean. In my paper, I will trace the movement of such textual material, arguing for an intricately interconnected network of texts, authors, and knowledge in the pre-modern Arabic, but not only Arabic, Mediterranean. So, first of all, who was Ibn Abd Rabbi? Abu Uthman Sa'id ibn Abd Rabbi was a physician, astronomer, jurist, and a poet. His uncle was the author of the famous anthology Kitab al-Aqd al-Farid, which might be known to some of you, but it's fine if not. His date of birth is unknown, and he died either in 943-44, 953-54, or 966-67 Common Era in Cordoba, and I'll have more to say about these speculative dates of death in a second. Not much is known about his life and influences, but he did leave behind 3 texts we know of, although only 2 of them are extant. One of these texts is a dispensatory, or a compilation of medico-pharmaceutical recipes, which has come down to us in 3 manuscript witnesses. These are a London copy in the British Library with the title Kitab Sina'at al-Yad min al-Ashriba wa ghayr dhalika, translated as the Book of Handicrafts regarding drinks and other things. There was a Damascus copy in the Dar al-Kutub al-Zahiriya, which we don't know if it still exists there due to the war in Syria. It was titled Kitab al-Dukan li Ibn Abd Rabbi, meaning the Book of the Apothecary's Shop by Ibn Abd Rabbi. And fortunately, there is a facsimile now in Dubai at the Juma al-Majid Center, so it is still possible to access this version of the text, thankfully. And then finally, there was a copy in Aleppo. Again, we do not know its current situation, but we know it was titled simply Al-Aqrabadin, or the Dispensatory. I was able to access 2 of these manuscripts digitally, the British Library one and the Damascus one, although the latter is only available in a very bad black and white microfiche scan, with the original, as I said, likely destroyed. The manuscript I worked with most for my master's thesis, out of which this paper has arisen, is the British Library one, which likely dates from the 15th or 16th century. It consists of 4 distinct treatises, all copied in the same hand. And of these 4 texts, 2 are known and have been edited. These are the Kitab al-Aghdiyya, or the Book of Foodstuffs, by Andalusian physician Ibn Zuhair, and the cookbook Fidalat al-Khiwan fi Tayyibat al-Ta'am wal-Alwan, The Abundance of the Buffet, Concerning the Pleasures of Food and Dishes, by also Andalusian author Ibn Razin at-Tujibi. The third text, a compilation of recipes on stain removal, currently forms the focus of my PhD project. The fourth text is identified as our text, the one I'm talking about today, the Kitab Sanat al-Yad min al-Ashriba wa ghayr dhalika by Sa'id ibn Abdurrabbi in its colophon. It consists of 67 folios and was compiled in Al-Andalus in the 10th century Common Era, although this particular manuscript copy that I'm referring to probably dates to the 15th or 16th century, as I mentioned. I will be using the title Sina'a to refer to this text as a shorthand during my presentation. And I have brought you a manuscript copy from the British Library manuscript, which is a very pretty manuscript. So what makes the text special? It is the earliest and one of only a couple of works on compound drugs that we know of from Al-Andalus and North Africa. It shows very early connections between the east and west of the Arabo-Islamic region. It allows us to retrace the transmission of pharmaceutical knowledge, and despite these facts, it is unedited and largely unexplored to date, which is good for me. I have put the structure and contents of the text here on this slide. I'm not going to read it all out, but you can look if you want to. So it consists of 17 topical chapters, and each of the recipes commences immediately below the chapter headings. There's no introduction, there's no theoretical material, and this is one of the reasons why this fairly short work, consisting, as I said, of just 67 folios, is made up of approximately 500 distinct recipes, which comes out to about 3.7 recipes per page on average, so quite dense. The chapters appear to be organized in a fairly arbitrary sequence, which I have found to be very typical of medieval Arabic pharmacopoeias, since all of the works I compared to the Sina'a have a different chapter order, as can be seen in the following chart. I've only put 5 other works on here because it would have been too confusing, but I compared 13 texts and none of them have the same exact chapter order. What is striking, however, and what you can see on the slide in the dark yellow, is that the text includes chapters on perfumery with sections on compound perfumes and incenses, along with more typical chapters such as those on electries, stomachics, and pills. No other texts where this is the case are known to me, with the exception of larger medical compendia that also cover a lot of other topics such as surgery or medicinal advice more generally. I also compared several recipe collections on perfumery with the Sina'a, and again, none had the same structure and chapter sequence, meaning that Ibn Abdurrabbi didn't simply take a chunk of perfumery recipes from another source and insert them into his dispensatory. Rather, he purposefully and intentionally chose and arranged the recipes he wanted to include from the sources accessible to him. Interestingly, Ibn Abdurrabbi places the indications, so which illnesses or ailments a given recipe will help with, generally at the end of his recipes. Almost all other compilers of pharmaceutical dispensatories I have surveyed place these indications at the beginning of individual recipes, or even at the beginning of a chapter that will then contain only recipes dealing with one pathology. This could indicate either a practice common in Al-Andalus or an idiosyncratic approach specific to Ibn Abdurrabbi, and I'll have more to say on this in a second. While Ibn Abdurrabbi does not always mention, or not even often mention, the sources of the Sina'a's recipes, it does happen on occasion. Examining these references allows us to retrace at least a few influences on the text, even if there's often no way to definitely verify the attribution of the recipes. This is true especially for the forefathers of pharmacy, medicine, and pharmacology in the Arabic tradition, cited in the Sina'a, such as Galen, Hippocrates, and Dioscorides. Their names were normally used only in a fictitious sense to enhance the drug's efficacy, not in the concrete sense of denoting the actual source of its composition. Nevertheless, such attributions point to the continued authority associated with these names. As far as I can tell, 6 of the Sina'a's recipes are attributed to ancient Greek medical authorities. These are a quincerb, according to Dioscorides, Galen's cordial, a recipe for the great Camunia attributed to Hippocrates, a yellow turmeric zabid by Galen, a recipe for an electuary according to Galen, and an ophthalmic powder also attributed to Galen. We'll take a closer look at 2 of these recipes here, and the first of them is for a quincerb according to Dioscorides. It is a very interesting case. I've put the Arabic and my English translation here on the slide. It reads, take quinces and clean as described before. Cut into little pieces, then take of this 12 mun and add grape juice to it. Leave for 30 days, then drain and store. It is also made according to another method. Take 12 parts quince juice and mix it with 1 part honey, then store. Uses. Settles the stomach, suitable for those with intestinal ulcers or pain in the liver and kidneys or difficulty urinating. I had originally assumed that, like in many other cases, Dioscorides' name was only attached to the recipe to lend it authority. However, thanks to a footnote in Oliver Kahl's edition of Sabur ibn Sahil's Dispensatory, I was able to match it with a recipe from Dioscorides' De Materia Medica. As you will see in a moment, the two recipes are almost identical, and I have here pasted Kuhn's edition in the Greek and Latin translation, and you can see a slide from his lovely edition. And as you can see here, the two recipes are almost identical. So Ibn Abd Rabbi must have copied his version from Dioscorides' book in some sense or another. This is highly plausible, fortunately for me, because in 948 or 949 Common Era, Byzantine Emperor Porphyrogenitus sent an illustrated Greek copy of Dioscorides' book to the Umayyad Caliph in Al-Andalus, who was then Abdurrahman III. The latter, so Abdurrahman, sponsored an Arabic translation of the text, which generated an Andalusi pharmacological tradition that would continue into the future. The arrival of this text in Al-Andalus in 948-49 gives us a terminus post quem for Ibn Abd Rabbi's death, ruling out the first proposed date that I mentioned of 943-44, and also making the second one, 953-54, less likely, considering the time it took for the Greek text to be translated and then to be consulted by Ibn Abd Rabbi for the composition of his Sina'a. It remains an open question why Ibn Abd Rabbi does not quote more recipes from Dioscorides, or if he does, why he only mentions his name once. This recipe, and I'll go back, however, offers a unique insight into Ibn Abd Rabbi's style of compilation or editing. While he sticks very closely to the original, as you can see, he condenses the description of cleaning and de-seeding the quinces to a simple, take quinces and clean as described before, hereby referencing the preceding recipes that he includes for quince syrups, which go into more detail regarding the peeling and de-seeding process of the quinces. This demonstrates how Ibn Abd Rabbi didn't simply take a recipe from Dioscorides' text, but carefully fitted it into his section on quince syrups, eliminating superfluous material. I'll skip this. And I have brought you a second recipe attributed to Galen. As a caveat, I do not read Greek yet, so I was not able to trace it in the text attributed to Galen, but if any of you have come across this particular recipe, I'd be delighted to hear. So it reads, Galen's cordial. Take white and black pepper, long pepper, ginger, galangal, Chinese cinnamon, cassia, sweet cypress, saffron, cloves, and anise. 2 ounces of each, and Indian spikenard, cardamom, wild ginger, balsam wood, and seeds, dried myrtle seeds, and sweet costus, 1/4 ounce of each. Grind all this, sieve, and knead with clarified honey, then store. Its dosage is a mithqal in the morning and before sleeping, as well as at mealtime. It is good and tested. Very curiously, some form of this recipe seems to have survived into modern times. If you Google Jawarish Jalinus, which is the Arabic title of this recipe, Galen's cordial, you will find several Iranian websites for Islamic Yunani medicine selling a cordial with a surprisingly large amount of overlap in ingredients. And I have bolded the ones in the recipe that also appear on the side of this somewhat suspicious looking medicine. Coming back to the Sina'a, Ibn Abd Rabbi also cites various other physicians and men of science from the Arab world, with a broad temporal and geographical range, reaching from Abbasid Baghdad to Aghlabid Qayrawan in what is now Tunisia, and including members of diverse religious communities. These cross-regional connections attest to a vibrant exchange of knowledge between the Arabo-Islamic East and West already in the 3rd and 4th centuries after the Islamic conquests. Among these are Yohanna ibn Masawai and Sabur ibn Sahil, who were 2 Christians from Central Asia, and Abu Bakr al-Razi, who were all from the East, as well as several physicians whose sphere of activity was the medieval Tunisian capital Kairouan. Among them, Ishaq ibn Imran, Ishaq ibn Sulaiman al-Israeli, and Musa ibn al-Azhar. All three of them were Jewish physicians. And then finally, another author from Al-Andalus, Abu Bakr Yahya ibn Ishaq, who was a Muslim. I want to share very briefly 2 case studies from the Sana'a, which I was able to trace across several recipe collections in order to show, on the one hand, Ibn Abdurrabbi's practices as an editor and collator of recipes, and on the other hand, demonstrate how far such recipes traveled across the medieval Mediterranean. So in the first case study, Ibn Abdurrabbi quotes from Ishaq ibn Imran, and I have highlighted the differences in the Arabic here. I don't know how many of you read Arabic, so I'm going to skip to the English translation. And again, I've highlighted the differences in yellow. I hope it's somewhat visible. And you can see that these 2 recipes are very similar. Ibn Abdurrabbi added some religious formulae. So he says, God the Sublime willing in the second, third of the recipe. And at the end, he says, if God permits. And he also moved the indications, which I have printed in bold here, to the end compared to Ishaq ibn Imran. So that seems to have been his preferred practice. And I said I would say more about this. My speculation is that maybe he just continued doing what he saw in the Dioscorides translation and applied that to his own texts, but that is pure speculation. And there's just a few misreadings whose nature indicates that the transmission very likely occurred through writing rather than dictation or orally. My second case study is a recipe that occurs in 4 different texts. It's a recipe for an incense. And once again, I have here the Arabic with differences to version A, Ibn Abdurrabbi's text highlighted in yellow, and here also in the English translation with dates, so you can have an idea of where these texts are from and what time. So this recipe appears to have been very popular. It crops up in texts from at least the 11th to the 13th century, written in both the Maghrib and the Mashriq. And it is likely that, so it references Yahya ibn Barmak. Ibn Abdurrabbi says Barmak ibn Yahya, so there's been some confusion here, but he was a member of an elite family in Abbasid Baghdad, whose name came to stand for luxury. And so I think that Ibn Abdurrabbi might have confused his name because it came to be something like a brand and not really denoted an actual person, but I'm not sure about this. And it is likely that any purported original version of this recipe, if it existed, actually used in the Barmakids household would have come from Baghdad, although it is entirely conceivable that the label could have simply been applied to any recipe that was deemed extravagant enough. The 4 recipes, as you can see, share enough similarities to assume a common ancestor and various traditions developing independently due to geographical and temporal distance, with the version D in the cookbook Kitab al-Wasla ila al-Habib clearly being the most divergent one and possibly stemming from a different source. Overall, the Sana'a's recipes appear to be more closely related to Ibn al-Jazar's version, which in turn is then very similar to al-Zahrawi, and texts A and B, so Ibn Abdurrabbi's and Ibn al-Jazar's text, also share at least 13 recipes on perfumery. So to conclude, I would like to stress once again that this is tangible evidence for the transmission of Greek pharmaceutical and medical knowledge way beyond the Eastern Mediterranean by way of the Byzantine Empire. We can speculate that Ibn Abdurrabbi might have been influenced by Dioscorides' practices in the writing of his text, because he has 2 distinctive features that differ from the practices of later compilers of dispensatories, namely, he places the indications at the end of the recipe instead of at the beginning, and he includes chapters on perfumes and aromatics, which later and elsewhere form their own distinct genre. These represent conscious editorial choices Ibn Abdurrabbi made to organize his compilation of recipes, possibly in part influenced by his source material. At the same time, the Sana'a is an early witness to a genre that later enjoyed much less popularity in Al-Andalus and the Maghrib, where we mostly know of botanical compendia and works on simple drugs, but not many pharmaceutical dispensatories from the era after Ibn Abdurrabbi's death. Thank you very much. I have put my image sources on here if anyone's interested. And thank you.
Thank you for perfect timekeeping, 20 minutes. And the next speaker is Jan van Doren.
Thank you. All right. So thank you everyone for being here now in this very dark room, appropriately for our talk about dark age materials. Although that term is no longer allowed, so only for puns. My talk today is about Anthimus' De observatione, ciborum, and I've used a quote from Anthimus that he himself then attributes to previous authors, that all excesses are harmful. Omnia nibia nocent. This will, as this paper will make clear, help me talk about the tradition of Anthimus and Carolingian period manuscripts that contain this particular text. But for an overview, really quickly, I'll start with an introduction of who Anthimus is and his text and some of the questions surrounding the author. And then I will give you a larger overview of the manuscripts that contain Anthimus or parts thereof or summations thereof. And then I'll pick two of those, Valafrit Strabos Vademecum, but with a question mark because this attribution has recently been questioned. And then the Loosja Arzneibuch, a very important and well-known early Carolingian collection of medical texts, even defending the practice of medical recipes, but also using medicine as a way to heal. So we'll begin with my introduction of Anthimus. We know very little of this author. He may well be a physician that was said to have been exiled under Emperor Zeno. But from that moment onwards, we know very little of him, except for the fact that he wrote this letter for the Frankish king Theodoric. He was either an imperial or a Byzantine imperial or Ostrogothic legate. Yitzhak Hen has recently doubted the old knowledge, or just the old assumption that he had stayed at the Ostrogothic court for most of his life after exile, because he was likely allowed to return after Zeno's death. He wrote the Observatione ciborum at some point during Theodoric's life, so 511, 544, hence the date of this Norwid. Some have called it the first French cookbook. I don't attribute it here, especially because this is a sort of more broadly held notion, more popularly held notion that this is the first cookbook of French cuisine. But this is obviously not entirely the case, because this is a text written by a Byzantine, so Anthimus, a Byzantine physician, who has had a bit of a rough reputation throughout. Karl de Roux, when he started studying Anthimus, called him une médecine simple, voire simpliste, so a simple, or his art simple medicine, or even simplistic, but later adapted or adjusted his opinion to une médecine gourmet, so a sort of chef doctor. But recently, your own Professor Maciej Kokoszko has more accurately, and this fits with the general trend, described him more as not only an active, but also a creative physician, showing the ways in which Anthimus adapted the knowledge that he had from more ancient medical sources to a new and very practical letter that he wrote for Theodoric, which really emphasized good eating practices and really his own particular vision that one should not eat raw foods. This was the thing that Anthimus harped on about, but also that in this text he had incorporated a lot of previous knowledge and therefore translated it to a new audience that was obviously seeking some guidelines as to what to eat and how to eat well. And Hen, for that sense, in that matter, has called it a culinary guidebook of what is socially appropriate, so that it is maybe even a text that tells a new Frankish king how to eat and how to eat in a sort of Roman appropriate fashion, even with the inclusion of more Frankish ingredients like bacon, beer, and mead, and some substitutions occurring. My project here today is to use the Carolingian manuscript material to actually show you how 8th and 9th century authors appreciated Anthimus, so how they saw him. Was he this chef cook or this chef doctor? Was he an amateur did they not really recognize as value? Well, what does the manuscript context of this particular text tell us about what Carolingian authors, or Carolingian compilers at least, thought about Anthimus? And to do that, we will move to the first real section of this talk. So look at the Carolingian period manuscripts containing Anthimus. And these are, unfortunately, the slides that contain a lot of text, but we will try to get through them relatively quickly. So the famous Lorscher Arzneibuch, Bamberg Staatsbibliothek, Bamberg, Manuscript Medicine 1, stems from the late 8th, early 9th century. There's a bit of debate about this. And it contains a long series of texts that help contextualize medical knowledge for a Carolingian audience. Though its uniqueness has recently been challenged, it's very obvious that there are other different texts that are trying to do the same thing, making ancient medical knowledge with this pagan connotation more appropriate for use in a Christian society. This is a text that very emphatically situates medicine within a Christian tradition, starting with a Defensio Artis Medicinae, which is not the original title of this text, but a discussion of how the medical arts fit within a more Christian tradition, and then using several other texts, like the poem by Isidore, to help situate it even better. The overall Lorscher Arzneibuch is very pragmatic in a sense. So after these more rhetorical openings and a dialogue by Aristotle on the Problemata, it really moves into very pragmatic texts and 5 capitulationes, so 5 collections of recipes and treatments, and a dietetical calendar at page 41V as well, which I haven't looked at for today, but Claire has now inspired me that this is something to look at further. And then at the end of this text, and this is a feature of Anthimus' letter, it often appears at the end of manuscripts, we find an abbreviated version of the letter of Anthimus to Theodoric. And I'll talk more about the abbreviation in a second and what it can tell us. But obviously, just as a side note, Anthimus here is integrated within a list of very pragmatic medical and dietetic knowledge that was meant for use and for practice, rather than being used as sort of either a peculiarity or something that was odd. It's very smoothly integrated and a part of this text. And we can see the same thing in most of the other texts that contain Anthimus. So here we'll start with the St. Gallen's Bibliotheek Codex Galliensis 878, which for a long time has been considered Walafrid Strabo's Vade Mecum, a book that he would bring with him, and that Bernard Bischoff, a famous Carolingianist paleographer, had identified with his hand, and even with several stages of Walafrid's life. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. This is a composite manuscript, so it contains 5 codicological units, roughly in chronological order. Unit 1 is not the earliest. I think it's Unit 3 that's the earliest. But overall, it shows an evolution of interests, but also very broad interests. So there's a codicological unit with works on grammar, one with Rabanus Maurus de Computo, so with on Computus, and a so-called chronograph of 354, also trying to, again, place Computus and Christian reckoning of time in a particular framework. Codicological Unit 3 continues this interest with works on chronology, history, and the natural world. And then Codicological Unit 4, for our interests in medicine and dietetics, starts with a calendar. So again, this relationship between time, when to eat, and more specifically, medical texts. So Hippocrates' Epistola ad Antiochum, several recipes well known to especially with Old High German because it contains Old High German glosses, and then some very different texts, a prose moral admonishment, a letter from Charlemagne to Alcuin, and then a letter by Seneca to Lucilo. So again, it shows this composite interest in broader knowledge combined with medical texts. And then finally, we find Anthimus in the 5th codicological unit. Importantly, not in the main hand of this manuscript, but in a hand that is shown clear signs of having been corrected and read well over time. And we find his letter before a brief treatise on phlebotomy and on the Egyptian days or the dark days, then some geoponical and medical excerpts, and finally, again, some historiographical excerpts from Eusebius and Eroges, and medical recipes, and a brief admonition, which was added, and a declension exercise, which were added probably slightly later. Again, here, Anthimus is situated very clearly within these medical contexts and within a situation where it's coupled with phlebotomy and this idea that there are appropriate times to either eat certain things or to perform certain procedures. That shows us that they're taking this text rather seriously and that they're placing it not, again, by itself or in odd context, but within these broader medical and often Hippocratic and Galenic works. And the final manuscript that I'll look at in much more length shows this even more clearly. This is St. Gallen's Bibliotheca St. Galliensis 762, also a 9th century manuscript, probably the latest of the manuscripts that I've discussed. It starts, and this is a collection of 4 different books, started by a register that goes through all the titles of the first 4 books. It doesn't mention Anthimus, and that's because this is a composite manuscript that consists of several, again, codicological units, although in the same hand, that have later been compiled into one larger manuscript because of the proximity of the text's themes to one another. And then later, an even later hand had added even a final component, which again shows that this was seen as a medical compendium containing texts by Vindicianus, Oribasius, Hippocratical and Galenic texts, Gargilius Martialis, who's sort of strewn throughout many of these texts as well, and then as a separate component or as a separate codicological unit, Anthimus's letter once more in full. So this is probably the best text witness from the 9th century for this text as well, because I'll briefly go back to this one. This one has a strange title in that it also says this letter was written for Titus, the emperor. We don't really know who they're referring to, but there's a small difference track that eventually also starts attributing this letter to Pliny. So at some point later in the stages of its transmission, Anthimus gets a little confused, but in the 9th century, they're quite clear on who he is and list his titles very frequently. So, Vere Industris Comes et Dietary et Gloriosissimum Theodicum Regum Francorum. I'll not talk about this text at any length, but it's good to mention. There's a final indication that Anthimus had a broader transmission history in London British Library Sloane HK 3017, a 17th century manuscript that presumably contains a faithful copy of a lost 9th century Carolingian original. It's been treated as such, and it's also been used very emphatically within the editing process of this text, but it is currently inaccessible due to the British Library hack, and we know very little, or at least previous editors have spent very little time on the broader manuscript context of this. So does this manuscript only contain Anthimus, or does it give us an indication of other texts that might have been in this original manuscripts? I'm not entirely sure. It's something I'd like to look at further. But it also contains one of the fuller titles, and hence even the modern usage title, De observatione ciborum, in its title. A final mention of Anthimus appears in a manuscript we've seen before, Codex Angaliensis 751. Among a list of Dynamedia, the 225th chapter mentions that there was a brief text about what Theodoric, the king of the Franks, should do and observe for many of his infirmities. It is a highly abbreviated version of Anthimus, probably the most abbreviated that we found, and it is actually not very accurate. But it is clearly a text that was used as a mnemonic, because there's many different instances where we can tell that this was more of a mnemonic device. Me la mala, pira pessima, prona prudet, nuces nocet. There is an idea here that this was somehow knowledge that you could quickly ramble out and have available to you for good eating and good dieting practices, even if these do not meet the requirements of what Anthimus actually said. He doesn't really talk about pears, for instance, those terrible pears, the pessima pira, and he actually likes nuts quite a bit, so it's a little odd, but we can tell that there was a broader transmission of Anthimus into these more condensed texts, like we've also seen earlier with these Dioscoridus texts. All right, for the final bit, I'll quickly run through some of these manuscripts in more detail. So Walafrid Strabus Vademecum, that we saw earlier, this is a text that was long attributed to Walafrid Strabo himself and his own interests. So Anthimus's text in this manuscript would show that an abbot like Walafrid Strabo, a famous poet and a famous abbot, would have been interested in medicine and dietetics. Tino Licht of Heidelberg has recently challenged this because the hand that was attributed to Walafrid Strabo was actually pretty bad at Latin, which didn't quite fit his stellar reputation as a poet. But nevertheless, the monastic setting of this manuscript, even if it might not necessarily have been from Reichenau, is upheld. And we can tell here a strong monastic interest in these broader corpuses of knowledge that included medicine, that Anthimus was also very emphatically included. And this manuscript was read with great detail, both within the 9th century and then later on, as witnessed by some of the marginal marks. A later hand has really gone to town on in the margins. But we can see the R appearing at several times in the margin, which means that this was a point where someone who later read the work wanted the copyist to go back to the original copy to check the statements here. Because as I may or may not have mentioned yet, but Anthimus wrote in a slightly quizzical, or what has often been termed vulgar Latin. That's why linguists have been very interested in this text, because it is this sort of 6th century Byzantine, later Latin meant for a Frankish audience that really shows the evolution of Latin in late antiquity really well. So hence, some of the readings are a little dubious and might have needed a little bit of checking up. Bishop's argument about the life of the copyist is a potential clue to the rationale behind this manuscript, or at least I might find this convincing. Bishop found that the hand slowly evolved over time, and that this, the latest codicological unit, must have been written close to the end of the life of what he then considered Walafrid Strabo, but at a later stage in the life of this monk. And we might also assume that an older monk, an ailing monk, might actually become more and more interested in medicine as one goes along, or that this was a topic that became of particular relevance due to his age. The St. Gallen map, for instance, shows that healthcare was an important part of the ideal monastery, and that ideally a monastery should have a space for a doctor and for phlebotomy to take place as well. Right, then to the Lorscher Arzneibuch, which shows us that indeed excesses are harmful, or at least that excesses could be excised, because this is a text that has been highly abbreviated. So the preface was reduced by about 75%, really only containing Anthimus's core statement about raw meat or raw vegetables and raw food in general being bad. But it removed some of the things that we would actually expect in a manuscript that was defending or apologizing for the medical arts in a Christian tradition, because Anthimus's own overt statements about the use of medicine, but also about its position in sort of a Christian world, have been removed. The own ending of his preface, where he basically attributes medical knowledge to God, gone, which is a sort of strange expectation in or strange happenstance in a manuscript that had this function, defending the art of medicine. But it makes sense in that Anthimus is the final text, and this apology had already occurred at the start. But still, there is a clear choice to do that. Whereas other texts have also been abbreviated and substituted throughout. There's even a correction of some of the ideas that Anthimus upheld. There are also some interesting sections, including my favorite one, that are upheld. And it should appear here. Yeah, there we go. So this is his section on bacon, which is copied out in full, where Anthimus ascribes magical healing properties, or almost magical healing properties, to bacon for the Franks only. So the Franks can use bacon to heal themselves, whereas other people need medicine. The Franks can bind bacon, raw bacon, around their wounds, and it will miraculously heal them. It'll drive out worms from their stomach, and it'll help them with everything. And this section, which I always thought was maybe a bit of an in-joke, was faithfully copied and probably one of the most complete sections in this work. So clearly they were interested in this special Frankish medicine at Lorsch. All right, that brings me to my conclusions, and I've appropriately got a nice dessert picture here. What we can tell about Anthimus's transmission history is that it is predominantly situated in a practical, medical, and dietetical context, and that they really took Anthimus seriously. He is put alongside Hippocrates and Galen, and his connection to this tradition, which was long doubted, but which has since been, by scholars who know these traditions really well, shown that Anthimus was really using this transmission or this knowledge of these texts in a very playful and adaptive manner, is also borne out by how serious Carolingian manuscripts seem to have taken Anthimus. And despite the crude Latin, gleich barbarisch, Valentin Rose, the work was taken seriously for its therapeutic contents, as it did appear alongside these long lists of therapeutic treatments proposed. And they were in part adapted to post-Roman realities, making them perhaps even more attractive. And finally, it fits in with this sort of analysis of Anthimus fits in with new Carolingianist initiatives, I should have said on the slide, to establish medicine, with our own views on the Carolingians trying to establish medicine as a sacred art, sort of linking perhaps also to these apologies we've heard about earlier for alchemy as well. But medicine needed to be established, and Macleia has written extensively on this for Carolingian materials. And then it also fits with the more practical approaches to medical and dietetic and culinary writings, which will be heavily featured in Claire Burridge's forthcoming book, which I think will be here in June, hopefully. Yes. But overall, we can tell that this is a text that was taken seriously both for its knowledge and for its practical use. And that counters the older traditions that this was a text that maybe was of poor quality or was of poor craftsmanship, but actually it shows that it was useful to the people reading it, and the Carolingians, or at least Carolingian compilers, thought it useful and wise to include it in their medical compendia. Hence why we as scholars should also include it in our thinking about medical and dietetical knowledge in the early medieval world. Thank you.
Thank you again, 20 minutes precisely. Other questions? Speakers? Yes? No, you may go first. Oh, Hans.
I have some questions about Anthimus. Firstly, does the Lorschner Arznei book contain what he says about the Irish eating their meat raw?
Ooh, that's actually a good question. I don't have that off the top of my head, but I will look into that. But that is another one of those, assumptions that we might expect makes it in there, because this was a thing Anthimus really cared about. He really thought eating meat raw was bad. It's a long part of his preface. And then hence why it's so surprising that he has this bit about bacon and raw bacon being good for the Franks. He also has a slight rationalization that some things that are good for some people are bad for other people. They're generally bad, but they might oddly be good for other people. And he doesn't really resolve this tension within the text at all. But I don't know if it's in there. I should look it up. But that's
one other thing is I'll possibly get your email address later, because I'd love to track down the origin of that ad titum.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Oh, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question for Leonie, and it's about the Greek sources in your text. So you mentioned Dioscorides. So you have the passage that somehow corresponds to what you have in Dioscorides. And that's the only reference to Dioscorides that you have? Okay. And then you have the passage that mentions Galen. And I know you didn't check because of the language environment. So is that the only reference to Galen that you have as well in the text? Or you have other references, and if it's just, you don't have any theory or any, so it's just that usually if you find a reference to Galen, it will be a beginning of a recipe, right? So do you have any other references to Galen?
Yeah, so there were, There were 4 or 5 recipes in total, I think, in this compilation that mention Galen, which is a fairly low number compared to other Arabic pharmaceutical manuscripts, as far as I can tell.
Okay, so but they have not been checked if there's a corresponding recipe in Galen.
Not for this text. They have been checked for other texts. So I mentioned Oliver Kahl. He's done a lot of editorial work. Okay. And he checked for Sabur ibn Sahil's Dispensatory, for example, but I haven't been able to check for this text because, again, I don't speak Greek.
Okay,
yeah.
So the idea of of mentioning an author but being fictitious actually, so it might not actually be just to, so that's actually referring to other textual comparison that you have in other dispensatory, but not in this particular case. I mean, it's like, the idea is it might be fictitious because it works that way for other Arabic texts, right?
Yes, exactly. For this one, it's a speculation at this point. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for this is a really great panel, obviously, I think so anyway. I just want a couple of questions, one for Claire, one for Leonie, if I can. But Claire, just, I'm a bit confused, and I might have a question, I might not, depends on my confusion. So those texts that you had that were like your regimen types, were those regimen texts or were those embedded texts?
Sorry, yes, for reasons of time, I wasn't able to go through all of what Gronke has done, but he's looked at a score more of examples from manuscripts. And so some of those, these are the edited types that he's come up with. So those were comparisons to the edited versions, some of which are known only from a single manuscript, but in the first types, it's often like a dozen different manuscripts that are more or less along that same line. Does that answer?
This is just increasing my confusion.
Okay.
So, no, that's okay.
Oh dear.
It's
oh no.
Not your fault. It's on me.
No.
I'm just wondering. So, like the inclusion of several plant names in say like your martyrology text, right? Why assume that these are based on a regimen rather than say based on something devotional or like birth plans or things like this that are not strictly medical? But nevertheless, there's a common reason why both a regimen text and a birth plant might be associated with the same month, something like this. So this is kind of what I was wondering about.
Oh, thank you so much for that question. I haven't consulted birth plants, so that would be a very simple answer. But I will do that and see what the correlation is, because that would be another route to explore in terms of sort of calendrical thinking. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. The other question for Leonie, if I can, just quickly. When you talk about the Dioscorides connection here, I was immediately thinking there's a passage right when Dioscorides starts talking about compound perfumes in book 1, among the aromata. He says, this is a bit weird what I'm doing here, but I'm going to include perfumes here that are not simples, but compounds. So just as a kind of ancestor of what's going on in your text, and if you're looking to see, is this person modeling their text somewhat on Dioscorides, this might be another argument you could go with, which is to say, yes, it's not normal, but Dioscorides already made the argument, so perhaps there's even more of a kind of spirit of influence going on here than simply copying recipes.
Thank you, that's amazing. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I want to say thank you to all three, because I think too that was a really great session. I wanted to ask Claire about the particular mentions of medicinal plants, many of which would be local, and of exotics, spice plants, pepper. They appear to be treated as part of the same pharmacology rather than as separated. It's just an interesting point, because we were talking about why pepper yesterday at one stage.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think pepper comes up all the time for all of us. But yes, absolutely. That's what really struck me here, is that these different sort of levels. Sometimes it looks more like materials that could be prepared on any old kitchen table. It's a humble garden plant, or even what we'd think of as a weed, alongside something like cinnamon, cloves, much more the true exotics, and so that they're being seen in the same context, I think reflects just the bigger picture, and that it's not such simple, straightforward traditions, but a blend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. And just one other little question about about Constantine Porphyrogenesis sending the Dioscorides manuscript. I didn't know that. What is the direct evidence for that? does the manuscript survive with a dedication or something, or not? It's not that.
I have to admit that I haven't looked into this because I only identified this connection on Friday last week. So this is very fresh. I think Professor Tuil has the answer, maybe.
Yes, we have to be extremely careful about that story. It's a myth of, yes, of Arabic medicine history, historiography. I worked on it. The references to the Byzantine emperor are absolutely unclear. So we cannot use that as a chronological argument. First point. Second point, what is written about that is not correct. We don't know exactly what version of the text it is, because you'll find in the literature that this was the alphabetical version of Dioscorides, which we don't know. So extremely correct. And three, it is believed that this was the origin of a new translation of Dioscorides. Again, this is wrong. So we have to be extremely careful about that. It's clear that there was a manuscript which was sent to Cordoba, but we don't know exactly what. So I strongly encourage you to walk on edge about that. And going in the same direction, please use the edition of Dioscorides by Wellman, another one in the Kuhn collection by Sprengel, 1829. But so, I didn't answer exactly your question, because the answer is that technically we don't know exactly.
I'm so glad that I brought that up.
Thank you, yes.
You're still glad too.
Yes.
Because it seems so typical of Constantine Porphyrogenitus, who spent a lot of his time spreading scientific information around, that he would have done such a thing. So at least, thank you. Thank you to both of you.
We have a question online.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have a question for Leonie. I mean, this was an amazing talk for somebody who recreates fragrances. Did you have time to actually look how many of the recipes for fragrances are unique for this text, and how many are repeated, like the Barmaki incense was repeated in at least 3 other texts? How many of the other recipes were also like repeated in other texts, or how many are unique?
I mean, it's always hard to tell if something is unique, because it's unique until you find a parallel somewhere else. But I have identified parallels for at least 13 recipes with Ibn al-Jazar's book on perfumes, and then more, but I would have to look up the exact numbers and references. I'm happy to send you an email if you would like.
Yeah, I would really appreciate. I mean, it's amazing. I hope that this will actually end up in the translation for those who cannot read Arabic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Yes.
Thank you. Congratulations to all three of you. It was fascinating. I just have a question for Leonie. You mentioned the section about the distillation waters. I just wanted to ask, what kind of distillation is it about? I mean, is it distillation through distillatory devices, or is it just decoction? Do you have a clue, I mean?
Yeah, so there's 2 separate sections. There's one on decoctions, and then there's one on distillations, and it's for fruit waters. Yeah.
And rose water, I suppose.
Rose water, fruit, yeah, I mean, I kind of count that as, but yes.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
I'll add one more if I'm allowed.
Yes,
Is
of
it
course.
fair?
We have 7 minutes.
It won't take 7 minutes. You mentioned Kubeb, Leonie. Kubebs, or at least your text mentioned Kubebs. That must be a fairly early reference to Kubebs in the Mediterranean. I can't remember when they first began to reach that far. Do you know that?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I think Professor Lev might have an idea.
Thank you.
I don't know.
I should add that I did mention yesterday that pepper was a good diuretic. I could have added that Kubebs are a much better diuretic, and they were in all the pharmacopoeias. They may still be in some of them. They were used by military physicians, certainly in the 20th century.
Any further questions? Otherwise, I just congratulate all three speakers for a splendid panel. All three talks by themselves, but also, you know, in combination, and how it combined.
Thank you.
A session together. So I personally am a bit biased. I was intrigued by the plant names because, you know, identification. If someone adds a plant name and that scribe also thinks that it's flowering in June, it's another indicator that this identification of plant persisted somehow. So that I thought was an important point. So yeah, thanks to all the speakers, and I think we now have Sean?
No, I was, that's right, I just was putting my hand in it.
Okay. Anybody else? Oh, okay, then we finish 5 minutes ahead of time and have time for lunch. Thank you.